In circa 813 BC, modern-day Tunisia, the city of Carthage was founded by Phoenician settlers. Before long, it would become the biggest trade center in the Mediterranean. Where there is trade, there is wealth, and with wealth comes power. It's because of the power it had that Carthage was such an enemy of Rome, another major power in the Mediterranean. The two powers fought three major wars known as the Punic Wars. In this documentary, find out about the two civilizations, how they battled each other, and how it all ended. Now, on the Siege of Carthage. Carthage had an empire stretching around the Mediterranean Sea. At its peak, it controlled territory in South and Southeast Iberia, Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, the Balearic Islands, and the northern coast of modern-day Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. Carthage was a mercantile civilization who gained power from trade and colonization. Unlike most civilizations in history, its armies had few soldiers who were citizens of Carthage. Instead, Carthage used its great wealth to field mercenary armies. These mercenaries came from all over the empire. There were the Iberians, known for their swordsmanship, Numidians, famous for their cavalry, Libyans, who fought like Greek hoplites, Celts, some of the bravest and toughest warriors, Cretans, skilled archers from the Isle of Crete, Samnites from southern Italy, and citizens of the Balearic Islands, great with the slang. While the amount of cultures in Carthage's army meant that there could be language barriers and disorganization, it also meant that the army was very versatile, as each culture contributed its knowledge and the special traits of its soldiers to the army. They fought with a variety of arms and armor. For example, the Carthaginian phalanxes carried hoplons, sarissas, and the xiphos, like the Greeks did. Spanish troops often used a falcata or an espada sword, while the heavy infantry often carried scutums, an Italian design, and the light infantry and cavalry used caestra. The few citizen soldiers of Carthage who were peltasts also threw javelins and carried a thurios shield. The Celtic longsword was the weapon of choice for some of the barbarian mercenaries. It is part of Carthage's iconography that they used elephants in battle on occasions. However, they did not use the big African elephants. Instead, they used African forest elephants, which are smaller. Rome, the enemy of Carthage, had an empire built on conquest and military strength rather than trade and wealth. This is one reason why the Latin culture disagreed with the Punic culture. Their military structure was much different to the Carthaginians. During the time period of the Punic Wars, the Roman army was comprised of citizen soldiers which had different roles in the army depending on the social class. Roman armies in this time were also not standing armies, but instead mandatorily conscripted when needed. A conscript could be made to serve in the army for up to 6 years. Roman soldiers had to buy their own equipment. The poorest Romans joined the velites, a group of skirmishers who wore little to no armour, carried a shield, and were sent to throw javelins at the enemy before a battle. The rest of the Roman infantry formed three battle lines known as the triplex axes. The first line were heavy infantry called hastati. These young men carried a scutum shield, a sword, such as a gladius, two pila javelins, and wore heavy armour. They were the least experienced out of the three battle lines, but were eager to prove themselves to Roman advance in rank. They mostly would have been in their early 20s. The next battle line, the principes, were armed the same as the hastati, but were often a little bit richer and more experienced. This also meant that they might buy slightly better armour, such as chainmail. Principes were men in their prime and were usually aged in their mid-20s. They would fight once the hastati had become tired. The final line of heavy Roman infantry were the triarii. They were the oldest, most veteran and wealthy infantry. They had the best armour in the infantry because they could afford it, and they carried a spear called hasta. The triarii were the last line, so were often only used when necessary. Another role of the triarii was to cover the retreat of allied soldiers in such an event. As well as infantry, there were cavalry. They were called equites. Equites were the upper class of Roman society, also known as equestrians. They were wealthy enough to afford a horse as well as their own armour. They were heavily armoured and carried a round shield and a lance. In a mid-republican legion there were roughly 1200 velites, 1200 hastati, 1200 principes, 600 triarii and 300 equites. In camp, a contubernium was a group of 6 to 8 soldiers who lived in a tent together. Roughly 10 of these groups formed a century of 60 hastati and principes, and 5 contuberniums made a century of 30 triarii. Each century was commanded by a centurion. 2 centuries made a maniple of 120 hastati, 120 principes or 60 triarii. 10 maniples of each class of infantry formed the 1200 soldier battle lines of hastati and principes, as well as the 600 triarii. Completing the triplex axes were the 1200 velites and 300 equites. The organisation of the Roman army made it the ultimate killing machine for centuries and was the key to its success over other civilizations. The equites were made up of 10 squadrons of 30 men called turmae, each choosing 3 decurios to lead the squad, with one of these acting as the main leader of the squad and the other 2 acting as deputies for him. The First Punic War was fought for control over Sicily and Corsica. Carthage had power on these islands, so strategically placed in the Mediterranean. After Carthage involved themselves in a dispute between 2 west coast cities of Messana and Syracuse in Sicily, Rome challenged them in the first of what would be 3 wars between the 2 ancient civilizations. It was mostly a naval affair that lasted for more than 20 years between 264 BC and 241 BC. The Romans were victorious in the end and gained control of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica and the Balearic Islands. Hannibal Barca wanted revenge on Rome for humiliating Carthage in the First Punic War. He gained territory in Iberia and built up an army before breaking the peace treaty between Carthage and Rome by attacking Saguntum. In 218 BC, the Second Punic War had started. Hannibal marched with his army over the Alps and attacked Italy. He was hugely successful at defeating the Roman armies in battles at the river Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. While Hannibal was still terrorizing Italy, Scipio Africanus Major invaded Africa, and Hannibal with his army was recalled to defend his homeland. Scipio and his Romans met Hannibal and his army at the Battle of Zama, where Hannibal was defeated and the Second Punic War ended in 201 BC. As a consequence, Carthage's navy was limited to 10 ships and they weren't allowed to raise an army without Rome's permission. They lost control over Iberia to the Romans and had to pay them 10,000 talents over 50 years. This was equivalent to about 300 tons of precious metal, such as gold. Because of the military restriction imposed on Carthage by Rome, Carthage's neighbours took advantage and took Carthage's territory across the coast of North Africa. The only land that Carthage still controlled was about half of Tunisia. Carthage was now a shadow of its former self and a vassal of Rome. After 50 years, Carthage paid their debt to Rome, but Carthage was still in a very weak position. Historian Adrian Goldsworthy writes, "The Third Punic War was deliberately provoked by the Romans." He says that Roman negotiators shamelessly exploited the Carthaginians' willingness to grant concessions in their desire to avoid war with Rome, steadily increasing their demands to force a conflict on a weakened enemy. Adrian said that its outcome was never really in doubt unless the Romans decided to abandon the expedition. Rome created and looked for any reason to start the Third Punic War. One such reason was Massinissa, king of Numidia. Massinissa's aggression towards Carthage in 150 BC had Carthage retaliate by force of arms. This meant that Carthage had raised an army and this broke the treaty with Rome. Rome used this as their justification for starting the Third Punic War in 149 BC. But before declaring the war, they demanded reparations from Carthage for breaking the treaty. Rome took 300 hostages and made Carthage surrender all of their arms and armour. After taking away the Carthaginians' tools to fight, Rome stipulated that the Carthaginians must emigrate 10 miles inland. This drove the city into a revolt because Carthage's economy relied entirely on trading overseas. Either way, Carthage could survive neither the demands of the Romans or the military of the Romans, so they decided to go down fighting. The whole of the Third Punic War was a long siege of the city of Carthage. Carthage resisted the siege for 2 years. Then, in in 147 BC, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus the Greater, took command of the Roman army. He tightened the blockade around the harbour and built a wall around it. As Carthage could no longer receive shipments of supplies, they would slowly starve. It was then that Carthage and Rome had their first major battle of the siege. In the ports, Carthage had built 50 trireme ships, and accompanied by smaller vessels, they snuck through a gap in the Roman blockade. They attacked the invading Roman fleet and found success, inflicting major casualties on the Roman navy. However, the small victory was nowhere near enough to break the blockade, let alone repulse the invasion force. After the Battle of the Port of Carthage came the Second Battle of Nepharis, which came after the First Battle of Nepharis a year before. Nepharis was a stronghold just south of Carthage. Rome failed to capture it on their first attempt, but by the time they made the second attempt, they had properly blockaded Carthage and cut off the supplies being sent to Nepharis. There were up to 10,000 defenders in Nepharis, which was completely surrounded by the Romans. The Romans won the battle decisively, killing 7,000 and taking 5,000 combatants and non-combatants captive. Only 4,000 Carthaginians managed to escape the slaughter. Just a few months later, the final assault on Carthage started. 80,000 Roman infantry accompanied by 4,000 cavalry faced 90,000 Carthaginian soldiers and 310,000 armed Carthaginian civilians. At the start of the siege, there were roughly 250,000 inhabitants in Carthage. By the time the final battle started, there were only 400,000. In 146 BC, Rome broke through the walls of the city in their attack on the harbour side. The fighting took place from street to street, with Rome capturing house after house. They worked their way towards the citadel, and the Carthaginians eventually surrendered. All but 50,000 enslaved Carthaginians were slain, alongside 17,000 Romans. The city of Carthage was razed to the ground, and some modern historians claim that Rome covered the land of Carthage in salt so the soil would never be fertile again. However, there is no evidence in ancient sources to support this claim. Carthage and its empire were completely destroyed after this battle, and Polybius records about Scipio. Scipio, when he looked upon the city, as it was utterly perishing and in its last throes of its complete destruction, is said to have shed tears and wept openly for his enemies. After being wrapped in thought for long, and realizing that all cities, nations and authorities must, like men, meet their doom, that this happened to Ilium, once a prosperous city, to the empires of Assyria, Media and Persia, the greatest of their time, and to Macedonia itself, the brilliance of which was so recent, either deliberately or the verse escaping him, he said, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." And when Polybius, speaking of freedom to him, for he was his teacher, asked him what he meant by the words, they say that without any attempt at concealment he named his own country, for which he feared when he reflected on the fate of all things human. Thank you very much for watching. This has been The Siege of Carthage.